Hello, I'm Robert Ellsberg, the publisher of Orbis Books, and I'm very glad to be joined here today by a new Orbis author, Wes Granberg-Michaelson, whose new book is called The Soulwork of Justice: Four Movements for Contemplative Action. Wes is a writer, a speaker, and global ecumenical leader who for decades has worked in the intersection of faith, justice, and public life. Among other things, he has served as Director of Church and Society for the World Council of Churches and General Secretary of the Reformed Church in America. And it would honestly take too long to list all the communities and projects he's been engaged in over the years. I've looked forward to this conversation for a long time. I presume Wes remembers, but we last met almost 50 years ago in 1977 when I was a very young managing editor of the Catholic Worker, and he was a pretty young associate editor at Sojourners, and he came to New York with Jim Wallace to interview Dorothy Day. And it's kind of incredible to think of the respective paths we've pursued since then that have brought us to this conversation today. And it's significant to mention that span of time because in part, his new book is about how to sustain yourself in the work of justice and other efforts to address the needs of the world over the long haul. But part of what makes the book so effective is that it's rooted in his own practice of the lessons he shares here. This book is, in effect, a gift from one of the elders in this movement. I can say elders because I'm not that far behind you, passing along hard-won wisdom to younger generations. So welcome, Wes. It's so good to see you again.
Thank you, Robert. It's just great to be with you again, and those memories are vivid.
Maybe you could start by just saying, what does soul work mean for you?
For me, Robert, soul work means the way we give attention to our inner lives and our own intersection with God that can sustain us and allow us to process the grace and the pain that inevitably comes into our journey and that comes into the world. I think we all have to develop a holding space to do that in order to sustain us in the ways in which God has called us to the work for justice, the work for God's purposes in this world, in a time when all that is more critical than ever.
Holding space is a word or a phrase that you use a lot in the book. And I'm not always sure that I understood, what that meant to you. Could you explain that?
Yeah, I think, Robert, it's like developing a spiritual infrastructure. I came upon that phrase when I was trying to describe what it has been like for anyone, including in my journey and others, to put together practices that really create the space that you need to detach yourself from the immediacy of all your concerns, from the onslaught of social media, from the urgency of demands, so that you are able to really process at a deeper level all that's going on. And that may be through journaling, it may be through various forms of prayer, it may be through retreat, it may be through different forms of meditation, it may be through disciplined walks in the woods, any number of ways that you adopt as a real rule of life that provides you with this holding space to process all you need to.
Mhm. Well, you've made yourself quite vulnerable in this book because you make it clear through your journal entries, which are kind of running commentary through or parallel to your discussion, that these are lessons that you have, in many cases, learned the hard way, contending, as you admit, with pride and ego, self-sufficiency, the desire to be noticed, to be in control, a fear of failure. Is this one of the more personal things you've shared?
I think it is, Robert. I've written a lot before, but I came upon this. It was actually during COVID. And if I go back to that time when you first met me, and I was with Jim, and we were coming to interview Dorothy Day, I had been impacted deeply by the Church of the Savior in Washington, D.C. And one of their practices was journaling. I'd learned how to journal as a as a space, a way to process my own inner life and my relationship to God as I was trying to discern it. And so I started keeping a journal. And I did that and have continued to do that for over 50 years. My wife and I were sitting in the living room of our home in Santa Fe, and she said, "What are you ever going to do with those journals?" And I said, "I have no idea." And she said, "Why don't you read through them all and see if there's anything worth passing on to our two kids?"
Mm,
So I started doing that. It actually took me a year to go through
mm,
them all and to then pull out what I thought might be worth saving and reflecting on. And it surprised me. And and through that process, I came up not only with something to share with our kids, but I came to see that any of our journeys, including mine, pass through these points of crisis and points of fear and desolation and anxiety that we have to learn how to live through, especially if we're involved in lives of outward activism. And I felt at this stage in my life, the best thing I could do was to share that, hoping that it might be an encouragement to others. So, unlike other books I've written, this shows more of my inner life.
mm, mm. Yeah. As you say, the kind of summary of the book is where you say your inner life will require an ongoing exploration as rigorous as your excavation of the external global structures of oppression and social sin. Well, why is that the case?
Well, Robert, like you, my whole life has been involved in one way or another in outward action and activism. In first working on the Hill against the Vietnam War and working with beginning of Sojourners and working on issues of theology of creation and then ecumenically and then in denominational work. It's always been this outward engagement. But what I've discovered is that it's so easy for any of us to simply deplete, burn out, lose our center, lose our way, because we haven't learned how to really look inward and do what's necessary to sustain us for the long term. Um, and when I look at my activist friends, and when I look at younger folks who are deeply engaged in trying to combat the cruelty and the evil at this time, um, I am so wanting to be with them and supportive and in solidarity. But my biggest question and my anxiety is, will they and all of us have what it takes to discover from within those things that will sustain us in the long term? And,
Mhm.
and that's going to require that kind of internal look at ourselves so that we can get out of the way of what I think God wants to do. Because otherwise, you know, uh, I think of it this way. Only and this is quoting from Kella Nicaranda in her book, The First Advent in Palestine, a marvelous book. She has one line in there I never forgot. Only the pain we name is available for transformation.
Mhm.
And I'd add to that, the pain we don't name, we transmit. We
Mhm.
transmit
Mhm.
it to others. And even the best leaders of social justice, the best activists, you see it a lot in our politicians. If if you're not dealing internally with all those issues, you just end up passing them on to others. And even the
Mhm.
best work we do, it's going to end up being harmed, others are going to be hurt, and the goals we reach for are not going to be fully attained.
Mhm. Well, in this book, you are kind of assume the voice of a therapist, maybe to the activist generation, or maybe a spiritual director. Uh, and and I would imagine anybody who is attracted to read this book maybe is already sensitive to the kind of problem that you're talking about, or at least is trying to, at least those who are motivated by some kind of religious or Christian commitment or faith to engage in the work they do social transformation. So the heart of the book are really these, what you call four movements. To me, that reminded me a lot of Henry Now, and a lot of his books are always,
Yeah,
from solitude to this, that,
yeah,
whatever.
yeah.
But the first, maybe we could just kind of go through those a little bit, and you could talk about
Sure.
them. The first is from, excuse me, the first is from self-sufficiency to belonging. Say a little bit about that.
Yeah, and when you mention Henry, it's really funny. I knew Henry a bit as you did, and when I was working with reading through all these journals and then discovering this, I was beginning to see these themes in myself,
Hmm.
and then beginning to see them more generally in others.
Hmm.
And and I actually did think of the way Henry used those phrases because they always stuck with me,
Yeah,
from loneliness to solitude,
yeah, right.
you just go through them. And I felt, I mean, it's not like I'm saying, these are like Eric Erickson's seven stages of
Yeah,
this or
right.
that, but I think they might be helpful. And the first one is from self-sufficiency to belonging. And at least I found, and I think so many of us find, that we live our lives finally in reference to ourselves
Hmm.
and to what we feel are the best fulfillment of our needs. And at one level, that's completely understandable and healthy. But if you don't get beyond that, it becomes, you can say, narcissistic. It becomes absorbing. It really captures us in a self-referential life.
Hmm.
And this can happen to I mean, this has nothing to do with our politics, our theology. It could happen to any
Hmm.
of us.
Hmm.
And I discovered it, Robert, when I went on a 5 week retreat in a Trappist monastery outside of Berryville. I was working in D.C. and long story, I was beginning to open up to this new inner journey I didn't understand and got leave from my job to go on this 5 week retreat. So I was at Berryville and I'm in the monastery living with the monks in a program they had. It was after Vatican II. And and came upon this book by Karen Horney called Self-Analysis.
Hmm.
It was in the library, and I started paging through it, and I read about neurotic self-sufficiency.
Hmm.
And I just read it, and I said, "Oh my God! I mean, I'm nailed. I mean, this is me." and and how do I move out of that continual self-referential life to a real commitment of belonging? And I think that requires a deep inner spiritual journey that you open yourself in ways which, in what Jim Finley likes to call graced awakenings, you discover that you belong to God's love in a way that is far beyond anything you can do, and that reorients you away from a continual self-referential life. And from one's belonging to God, then one's attached to how one belongs to God's love for all creation, how one's impelled and compelled to address all that harms God's intention for the world, all solidarity with the injustice and suffering in the world. It comes out of a transition from living a self-referential life to living a life that's rooted in belonging. That's the best way I could
Hmm.
describe it, Robert.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Um, the second movement was from certainty to connection. That's one that I identified with a lot because it's not just
You know,
simply,
th
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is so interesting to me. Um, I was raised as an evangelical and in a strong conservative evangelical background, and the kind of background where theological certainty was really important. You had to
Mhm.
know the answers.
Mhm.
And so I was always been kind of wired that way. And my journey led me to a place of finally recognizing that rational certainty is not going to be the avenue, the portal towards real faith. There's so much as I got into the Reformed tradition and then was in leadership Reformed Church in America, so everything about the Reformation, etc. But there's such a concentration even there on getting all the facts and beliefs of faith right.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I like to say to folks, I've kind of lost my belief in beliefs. Faith is different than belief.
Yeah, yeah.
And you've got to make a transition. And in that, so all the stuff, some books that you've published, all the stuff about deconstruction going on, that's all part of that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
But what do you get to? I think you get to points of connection where your assurance, your real security about your connection to God doesn't come through rational thought as much as it comes through deep emotional and inner connection. And that may happen in sacraments, it may happen in relationships, it may happen in connection to creation, but in the midst of your own rational doubts, you begin to encounter deeper levels that tell you, here's what is most real. And I think that's a transition all of us at one point or another end up making.
I was reminded of one of my favorite lines from Pope Francis was in an interview where he distinguishes between what he calls a laboratory faith and a journey faith.
Mm-hmm.
And he's really contrasting two kind of cultures within the church. I think even distinguished from his predecessor, where the fear is about relativism and uncertainty and doubt. Whereas he says, our faith is not like a laboratory where it's all propositions that just follow each other and we know the answers in advance, and where the greatest danger is uncertainty. He says, no, it's a journey faith in which doubt, uncertainty is part of the process of meeting God. It's the very biblical faith as far as he's concerned. I find that so helpful and applies to so many things. Certainly not just to social activists.
Well, I do too. And one of the best examples, contemporary, was from the movie Conclave.
Yeah, right.
In the talk that the Secretary of the Cardinals,
yes,
the talk he gives about the danger of certainty and the role of doubt. I mean, that little homily is worth the price of the movie and much more.
Yeah, I really agree with you. What about movement 3, from grandiosity to authenticity?
Well, grandiosity is simply pride on steroids.
Mm-hmm.
And this journey with pride, it's one that requires some careful kind of thought and reflection. The lectionary for last week happened to be the story about Jesus being invited to a dinner with the Pharisees, and he ends up telling them, those who exalt themselves will be humbled, those who will be humble will be exalted. And there's an initial level in which pride or security of the ego is really necessary for our emotional growth. And Richard Rohr talks in really insightful ways about this in Journey Upward. Many others have. But you get to a point of where that sense of ego has to equip you to give yourself away rather than to continually build upon itself. And that requires a real detachment from the reign and power of ego, because the only thing ego can master is more of itself. It just wants to continue to accumulate. And so this journey towards authenticity is a journey that breeds a detachment from the superficial sense, the exterior sense of this image we're trying to create, to the discovery of your really deep self. And in that is your authenticity. There's a great story that I use about a Buddha, a statue of a Buddha in Thailand. It was made in the 13th, 14th century out of gold, huge, memorable thing. And in the 1700s, there was a war coming, and they covered this Buddha over with plaster
mm,
and moved it. And the monks were all killed. The Buddhists survived, and it went on. People just thinking it was a beautiful plaster Buddha, and then I think it was 1957. There was a crack in the covering, and the monks went to discover, and they looked inside, and they saw inside it's actually gold. And it's a great metaphor for how we
mm,
use the exterior sense of ourselves to kind of be the picture of who we are, but inside deep
mm,
is
mm,
actually the image of God, which, it's like Leonard Cohen says, there's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. And I think that's true of
mm.
our lives.
Yeah, I thought a lot about this chapter because you draw a lot on the Enneagram and your
Yeah.
own kind of type
Yep.
three, who's
Yep.
the achiever, who needs recognition by others and affirmation and that sort of thing. And I thought, well, I don't know this. I'm a type 9.
Okay.
It's not really my thing. But then I began to think like, yeah, that the way that a lot of us, myself, we tend to like identify with this role that we have or this job that we have. So who am I? I'm the publisher of Orbis Books.
Yeah.
But take that away. Who is the authentic Buddha underneath
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
that plaster?
Yeah. That I think that is the question that we all have to come to ask.
Mhm.
Um, and I think it's a psychological question, but it's a spiritual task. One,
Mhm.
I don't know if it was Henry Nouwen or who it was, but I once heard a phrase I'd never forgotten. Prayer is detachment from the fruit of your actions.
Nice.
That you pour yourself out in what you do, but then you detach from it because that's not truly who you are.
Mm,
And having that more grounded sense of who you are is what I think leads to the discovery of what I like, what Merton, many others have called the true self,
yeah.
which is a self that's then is deeply connected to the whole of the world and to all that is happening,
Mhm.
outside of our own little ego.
There are a lot of great aphorisms like that in the book, like where you quote Richard Rohr, who says that the meaning of suffering is whatever makes you lose control.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, could have a whole meditation just on that line. The last movement is from control to trust.
yeah. Well, I think our society is addicted to control. Um, uh, you know, uh, it's David White, the wonderful poet, who, in a poem, "What to Remember Upon Waking," says, "What you can plan is too small for you to live.
Yeah, that was beautiful.
What you can plan is too small for you to live." And we're wired to want to control things and to want to strategize and to plan. And I've said, if you're involved in lots of organizations like you've probably been through countless processes of strategic planning and doing,
Yes.
and I now tell groups when I speak, I'm not doing any more 5-year plans, no more
Mm,
strategic planning. And everyone laughs and then they applaud because I think people actually are really tired of it. Because when you look even externally at things like COVID and the George Floyd murder and climate change,
mm,
you see these things happening that just demolish our ability to control events.
mm,
And so, even for organizations, it's the qualities of resilience and adaptivity which become so important. Well, I think it applies to us personally as well. We have to learn to live at a way that um, has a more realistic view about our ability to control events the way we'd like and a more clear connection to receiving grace
mm,
that comes that's not in our control, but that actually is the way that leads us forward. And when we think about lives of activism and political action and all the political world that I've had a lot of experience in, I think it becomes so important to kind of step back from our addiction to try to strategize and control and be far more committed to finding the spaces where we're called to respond and to act, even when we're not sure of what the outcomes are going to be.
Yeah.
Because I think that's where real creativity and change in any field finally comes from.
Well, you describe in the book a lot of times in your life, looking back, when you have kind of taken a leap of faith, or where the kind of scaffolding is pulled out from under you. And you talk about resilience. A lot of the secret of kind of being in it for the long haul is to be prepared for things not working out the way you
Yeah,
thought they would, even failing, having maybe even the opposite effect of what you thought they would have.
yeah.
Uh, and you write a lot about that kind of, there's the kind of letting go that we have to practice. But then there's also the things when things are stripped away from us, physically or vocationally or whatever. And sometimes those are the things that crack open that facade and give us that kind of graced moment that you talk about.
I think it's true. And I think when you look at the leaders of social movements that we admire, and especially religious. I mean, you've done, the definitive biography of Dorothy Day, and you think of so many others, Dom Helder Camara, and
Mm.
uh, even Nelson Mandela. I mean, you go on and on. Look at Martin Luther King. And if you really say, um, how is it that they provided the steadfast leadership? It's because they weren't rooted to immediate results. They were deeply rooted to a long-term goal and vision. And that took deep inner strength to develop that kind of resilience um, and resistance, but more than resistance, the power to project what an alternative really could be. And and I think often that does come when we face outcomes to what we try that are disruptive, that are crushing, that are disappointing, and we're then forced to step back and say, uh, if we can be faithful, we can believe that some things we do will be used in ways we can't even imagine for the goals that God intends. And I think that's also a huge biblical lesson. But when you look at any of the social movements, Robert, the abolition of slavery, the anti-colonial movement, civil rights, empowerment of women, anti-apartheid, trying to get an end to torture, and you look at those and consistently involved, there's a steadfastness and a
Mhm.
resilience and a trust that goes beyond just their kind of clear calculation around what will
Mhm.
work and what will control.
Yeah, I think of those, a lot of demonstrations I've been in where the question is, what do we want?
Yeah,
Freedom. When do we want it? Now.
yeah,
Well, we might want it now, but it's settled in for the long haul. It's going to be a longer struggle than
yeah,
that. You talk about ultimately, the of letting go, and the most profound or ultimate letting go is with death.
yeah.
But you talk about learning to die before we die,
Hmm.
and that as a kind of quality in a lot of those people like Nelson Mandela or Martin Luther King that you mentioned, that they were able not to just get over the fear of death, but as you say, liberation from the power of death.
I think it's a huge journey for us, and I think it's one that we don't focus on enough. Um, this movement from control to trust, which goes through, a lot of our life, comes to an ultimate place when we're faced with the prospect of our death, because that's the ultimate time when we realize we're not in control and where we are asked to trust at the deepest level possible. And I found in my own journey, I had to really confront earlier in my life a real kind of fear of death and to ask, what was that really about? And discover it's really about losing all that stuff that I was building up that was defining myself and was
Mhm.
giving me, a sense of accomplishment and identity. Um, and so I do think that when you learn how to die in that sense before you die, you achieve a greater level of freedom. And
Yeah.
I also have become really convinced that in the inner contemplative journey, you know, you each day we experience these moments when something beyond the material reality of life in front of us seems to want to break in.
Mhm.
And it may be in the smile of a newborn baby that we connect to in our eyes, or it may be in a crystal clear lake against snow-capped mountains. It may be in a point of sacrament and worship, but there are points when what is there, but not immediately before us, tries to break in. And I think that we're helped by making more space for that and realizing that when we come to that point where our physical life ends, we're allowing the full breaking in of what we have already touched and experienced at points in our journey. And I think
Mhm.
that's another way that helps us die before we die.
Mhm. You end the book with a long quotation from Thomas Merton. And it reminded me that as I was reading your book, I was very much in the back of my mind a famous letter that Thomas Merton wrote to social activists, or at least to
Hmm.
one in particular, Jim Forrest. You're probably familiar with that famous letter. And I thought if I could just quote from that, because it's sort of like a coda to your book. He said to this person, Jim Forrest as it was, "You are probably striving to build yourself an identity in your work, out of your work, out of your work and your witness. You are using it, so to speak, to protect yourself against nothingness and annihilation. That is not the right use of your work. All the good that you will do will come not from you, but from the fact that you have allowed yourself in the obedience of faith to be used by God's love. The great thing, after all, is to live, not to pour out your life in the service of a myth. And we turn the best things into myths. In the end, it is the reality of personal relationships that saves everything."
My
That was
goodness.
kind of a
I had
distillation.
forgotten. I knew Jim Forrest. I had forgotten that. That is so beautiful. It sums up in those sentences of the book. It
Yeah.
is. And it is. And I think, Robert, it is so, when I wrote this book and finished it, I had just to be current. When the time I finished the book and turned it into Orbis, I had no idea that Donald Trump was going to be elected president.
Yeah, right.
And what I experience now in talking to people and talking to groups, the kinds of things we're talking about here are so much more important than we ever imagined. Because the level of threat and of cruelty and of anxiety about our social and political institutions is greater than it has been in a long time.
Mm,
And the need for resistance, for response is so urgent. But if all we do is become reactive
mm,
and become those who demonize others and those who want to see this turned around by the next thing passed or by the midterms or by the next thing that could happen and lose sight of our deeper call for
mm.
a vision that has to finally take hold and overcome the prevailing sense of what we hear. I mean, unless we do that, we're not going to have what it takes
Yeah.
to be there
Yeah.
for the long term and to be prepared for when the possibility of something new emerges. So, yeah, what that the let that yeah, I have a memory of that from long ago, but haven't heard it read in years and years, and that is absolutely beautiful.
Yeah. I did feel there was a kind of timeliness to that. And when I think of how successful Donald Trump is in occupying our heads all the time, and And my wife has to say this is a Trump-free zone here. You know,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
when we go to sleep, we're not talk about it anymore. So anyway, well, we're running out of time here, but I want to thank you so much. This is a wonderful book, and it's been a great pleasure to talk with you again. Wes Granberg-Michelson's The Soulwork of Justice. And I agree with Merton that in the end, the reality of personal relationships saves everything. And I'm glad we can renew that relationship.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you so much. I'm very grateful to you and to Orbis.
Be well.
Thank you.